Welcome to week 10. This week we're going to look at behavioural economics.
As we do each week, we'll begin with our account of the problem. We'll try and situate this in relation to the other problems that we've considered so far, and then we'll look at the response. We'll look at how behavioural economists have responded to their problem. And we'll spend a bit more time this week than we normally do on the critical consideration, applying Stilwell's questions to theory itself. Who gains, who loses, doesn't matter. So the problem. In the weeks leading up to now, we've really been able to pinpoint a particular problem in the background historical context that informed the articulation of economic theory. But it's very difficult to do that this week. Behavioural economics sets its problem up in a different way, in an almost ahistorical way. So we saw previously that classical political economy, in the mould of Smith and Ricardo and so on, was really about how to prevent mercantilism and remnants from feudalism from undermining the widespread production of wealth. And we saw what their solutions involved, a calculation of what it is that's produced, underpinned by a new conception of wealth that's not static anymore, not just gold and silver, but actual an idea of gross national product. We also saw ideas like the formulation of techniques to increase production, removing tariffs and increasing and other restrictions on imports and so forth, concepts of comparative advantage and the like. And then when we move to Marxian and neoclassical economics, we saw that they took on the problem of the rise of industrialization and the effects of this, the disproportionate effects on this on the working class. Both were concerned with the rising social ills, and Marxian political economy wanted explicitly to explain this and overcome it. And neoclassical economists too, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how even neoclassical 19th century laissez-faire economists also themselves took on a strong position on distribution, who gets what, in relation to trying to explain why the working class were impoverished and how that might be overcome. Where Marx wanted to explain this in terms of a labour theory of value and in terms of requiring a new form of economic organisation. The neoclassical economists view an idea like public ownership of the means of production as partisan, as ethical, as merely subjective, as requiring coercive transfers of economic resources which would be inconsistent with liberty. So the neoclassical economists try to resolve this problem in the 19th century by trying to show how everybody would benefit from the spontaneous development of markets left to their own devices. So, but this strong position we saw too was really still did involve ethical positions, ethical substantive positions, even if it presented itself as merely objective. It rejected explicitly the idea of interpersonal comparisons of utility, the idea that $1 in the hands of a poor would be worth, the poor person would be worth more in terms of improving welfare than $1 in the hands of a rich. So we noticed that theory has been emerging in relation to these historical problems and taking on positions that reflect positioning in relation to politics, political power, and so forth. We were also able to show how feminism in Keynesian political economy also emerged in response to particular problems. So increased awareness of women's economic oppression, where certain institutions have become accepted as natural, when really they were grounded on constrained choice, social norms and the like. We saw feminist economists take on this problem. And we also noticed that Keynesian political economy, it too didn't emerge in a vacuum, but it tried to respond to the great crash of 1929 and the 10-year period of the Great Depression. And finally, last week on our journey to this point, we looked at Austrian neoliberal thinking, and we noted that it too emerged historically as an attempt on the part of business interests in the maintenance of capital in post-colonial countries, with the neoliberals really interested in articulating a competing vision of human rights as conditional on the existence of a well-functioning market, interested in ensuring price stability in order to contest the competing claims of those involved in formulating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I presented last week following Jess White's work, had really sought to try to secure greater scope for socio-economic rights to self-determination, particularly for post-colonial nations who wished to nationalise private enterprise, particularly in response to the exploitation of labour of their own people through colonisation. We saw that the neoliberal version of human rights, with the Mont Pelerin Society being founded in the very same period, 1947, 1948, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being formulated and discussed. We saw the neoliberals really were concerned about trying to secure global trade in the context of threats to the business interests of private entrepreneurs. So we've seen quite clearly all the way through this unit so far, even with respect to neoclassical economics in the late 19th century, that economic theory has not been formulated in a vacuum, but has emerged in response to distinct historical problems. But now when we face behavioural economics, I'm really struggling to try to understand the historical context, the historical problems in which the concerns of behavioural economists emerged. Perhaps you can help me out with this in the tute this week, if you have some ideas which I've overlooked. It seems to me, and I'll turn to the next slide in a moment, that the formulation of the problem of behavioural economics is done in a manner that's ahistorical. And by ahistorical, I mean as if one can formulate economic theory without reference to the particular socio-economic problems of the time. So it's a particular account of economics that's underpinned by a certain view of science. And this is why I've said that it is continuous with a view of economics as value neutral, in line with the way in which neoclassical economics sought to present itself, even if I've been wanting to provide that self-understanding as an outgrowth of a historical imperative. Behavioural economics continues that value neutrality, but it does so without that clear sense of historical problem that we've noticed with the other formulations of the different economic theories that we've considered so far. So the problem, as I said, is not easy to articulate this week. I've suggested that it really does present itself as ahistorical in its nature. And the problem seems to be how to understand the rules of human economic behaviour, given that it so often appears to deviate from the predictions of neoclassical models. So the idea and the problem is to determine the rules of human economic behaviour in the aggregate. So across cohorts of acting agents in particular context, given particular constraints and so forth, given particular faced with particular options and so forth. So to tease out this problem a little bit more, it seems to behavioural economists that the neoclassical assumptions about rationality don't really seem to map onto reality. So neoclassical economists have assumed that humans, individuals purportedly choose independently, an assumption of methodological individualism. Humans purportedly have unchanging preferences that can be expressed in utility functions. Humans also have complete information about the different choices available to them. And we choose the optimal choice. We try to maximize the satisfaction of our preferences. An option that satisfies more of our preferences will be preferred to us than one that satisfies less. There's an assumption there that we go for optimization strategies. And neoclassical economists have sought to explain how we do this using deductive techniques. By that I mean once a utility function has been stipulated and budget constraints, both time constraints and income constraints, have been identified, the idea is that one can work out how to optimize that utility function in a way that satisfies more preferences rather than less. So that would be optimization of utility functions. Or a neoclassical economist might also use this type of game theory reasoning derived from expected utility theory, where in general, and if you like, you can look up expected utility theory in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for an account for those who are familiar with the mathematical terminology and symbols involved. And for others who just want to get a sense of what it's all about. So expected utility theory is in general the determination of the utility to be expected from a particular option, a comparison of that utility with the utility likely to be expected from an alternative, and a decision which is based on which of those various options are likely to produce a greater utility. This has been referred to as Bayesian, a Bayesian approach to risk and to probabilistic decision making based on the probabilities of the different options involved and the expected utility, the utility that I expect to get out of different options along with their likelihood and probability. For those who haven't come across this idea before, it's enough to know that neoclassical economists try to work out the outcome in a deductive way without really reference to real humans and the way that they behave, but rather idealized humans defined in the above ways as I've depicted them on the slide, such that the outcome would follow even if there doesn't even exist an individual like that in the world. So deductive reasoning doesn't need necessarily to map onto reality for it to be true. It holds independently of whether or not a real person exists in the world capable of functioning and reasoning in that way. So economists have come to this with some degree of questioning as to whether or not it's worthwhile to pursue this sort of reasoning if it doesn't necessarily reflect how real individuals behave. Because of course in real economies and in real markets, we're interested in how people actually behave. So in the real world, we don't, suggested, have unchanging preferences. We certainly don't have complete information. And it's also suggested by the behavioural economists that we don't select in ways that maximize our expected utility. So the general problem is that the behaviour of economic agents deviates from the way in which neoclassical models tend to suggest rational agents should be behaving. And this seems to be not very useful if we really want to understand economic behaviour, so we can try to improve it, boost productivity, boost consumption, improve the livelihoods and standards of living of people in the world. There was a larger context here, namely the growth of cognitive psychology in the 1960s. Now, although this is a historical phenomenon, I'm not presenting this as a problem like I've previously presented the historical context for the emergence of the other economic theories that we've considered in earlier weeks. Rather, this is a background development in an interlocking and interrelated science, cognitive psychology, that led some scholars to be increasingly concerned about the lack of realism in neoclassical modelling. So this, the emergence of the growth of cognitive psychology in the 1960s was really interested in the brain as an information processing device, and was looking at the way in which brains can retain information and manage complex problems, showing that we do have retention issues and we are unable to calculate beyond a certain level of complexity. There was also a new interest in memory, problem solving and decision making, with experimental techniques used to test what humans do under different conditions. And with this growth of cognitive psychology came a real interest in how this might affect economic behaviour. And it became increasingly clear that neoclassical models were unable to explain the constraints on our capacity for cognitive processing and the effect that this has on our decision-making economies, in our economic behaviour. So how did behavioural economists respond? Well, they responded with experiments, studies in real-life contexts or in the laboratory to better understand the deviation of human behaviour from the neoclassical models. And they sought to apply knowledge from other disciplines too, in psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, social sciences and so on, to understand these deviations as well. But more than that, they also sought to use that knowledge, and this is where we'll get to part 3 of the lecture when we look at who gains, who loses, doesn't matter. Behavioural economists sought to make sense of this behaviour of less than rational humans in their economic activity. They sought to use this knowledge in 2 ways. On the one hand, as depicted by the photo Pret-a-Manger, which is a cafe, a French-based cafe in the UK, spread across a franchise, spread across most of the UK. They sought to give managers and entrepreneurs access to information both about their workers and about their clients and customers that would both improve worker productivity and would improve consumption and spending on the part of hungry people. And on the other hand, you've got so not just an implication for private entrepreneurs, but also an implication for the state. So here we've got a mother elephant nudging her baby elephant along in the right direction. We've got an element of paternalism, benevolence, and care there. We've got the mother elephant obviously has her own ideas of what is good for the baby elephant and is nudging that elephant along to make choices that will be better, both for productivity, I'm not talking about the elephant anymore, productivity, for standards of living, for social ends that are cooperative. So we've got, that's why I chose those 2 pictures today. With respect to Pret-a-Manger, Pret-a-Manger means ready to eat, by the way. Pret-a-Manger staff, drawing on behavioural economics, found that giving free coffee and food to customers, if staff were to give free food, coffee and food to customers they like or find attractive, this would both boost staff morale by providing some degree of excitement in the day, some degree of initiative, and it would also boost consumption with more people coming in, either because they've appreciated these random acts of kindness. Now, it wasn't actually advertised until it was revealed in 2015 or 2016 that this was an actual policy. So it was a managerial technique designed to foster the sort of economic behaviour both in the worker and in the consumer that would improve worker morale and profits. Yeah, and I've said enough on the nudge elephant photo for you to understand why I picked it. So using experiments then too, I could say a little bit on the government side of things. We'll have a look in a moment too about opt-in models. So organ donation, for example, will be boosted significantly if the default option is opt-in rather than opt-out, because even if studies have shown that 79% of people are willing to donate their organs, if the default option is opt-out, only 42% change their decision. But if the default is at opt-in, levels are at 82%, which is much closer to the 79% that reflects the true desires of the population. So those are the ways in which economics, behavioural economics, has sought to inform both private business and public policy using experimentation. And we're going to turn now to look at the nature of that experimentation, drawing the readings. So, as mentioned, this is an attempt to determine what real decision making is like and whether and how it deviates from neoclassical models. These are studies in real life contexts or in the laboratory. And I've already said that it applies to the knowledge from other disciplines. So what's the sort of behavioural methodology, if you like? Well, often in determining and designing experiments, behavioural economists would begin by identifying the assumptions underlying the theory that they wanted to test. So they might choose to be testing expected utility, or they might choose to test Gary Becker's assumption that in partnership or marriage, individuals are trying to maximize the utility functions involved. And after identifying those underlying assumptions, they'll construct experiments designed to test whether people act in accordance with that theory. These are usually laboratory experiments where experimental design could be more easily controlled, where certain elements of the situation can be controlled. It might be field experiments too sometimes. So an example of a laboratory experiment would be for example, if there are two people and you have $100, one person has $100 and they need to give a gift to another person of a certain amount of money of their choice, knowing that that other person will receive triple of what they gave. So if they gave $10, the other person will receive $30. And that other person is then obliged to choose to give back to the first person a proportion of what they've received. And the designers of the experiment are interested in what happens if people act selfishly and don't give very much, and what happens if people act generously. Does a generous act from person A lead to generosity on the part of the receiving person too? Does a selfish gift at the start also generate selfish behaviour, and so forth? So they look at trends in behaviour based on how people are acting under those conditions. That's just one example. Sometimes there might be field experiments, and Andrew Lee provides a number of field experiments in his very nice paper on how behavioural economics does and can shape public policy, which I am also providing you with as a reading for this week. Not required reading, but recommended. I think I'll provide it to students for next year, actually, because I think it might be a bit more intuitive. He recounts how experiments have been, data has been obtained from the field, from real life contexts, looking at gym membership, noting how Boston gyms, the typical gym member who signed up to a yearly membership actually ended up spending $17 per visit because they didn't use it as regularly as they initially expected to, and they didn't save the sort of money that they thought they would, even though casual visits only cost $10. So the average member who pays for an annual subscription to the Boston gyms actually loses $600 compared with if they just paid as casual. And there are other field experiments shown with respect to people being more likely to purchase a convertible if they test drive it on a sunny day, people willing to pay more for a house with a swimming pool if the sale takes place in summer. Interestingly, people more likely to enroll in a university if they visit its campus on a cloudy day. Cloudiness apparently increases the appeal of academic activities. So there's a number of experiments, field experiments there that Andrew Lee has provided us with in his article as well. So in addition to identifying assumptions underlying the theory and constructing experiments designed to test whether people act in accordance with that theory, behavioural economists then try to identify anomalies in decision making with respect to those underlying theories, and to try to work out what the rules are that guide decision making in those contexts. This leads them to modify the theory or create an alternative theory, deriving fresh implications and testing that theory again in new experiments, either in the laboratory or in the field again. So in these various theories that have been proposed by behavioural economists to try to explain some of these anomalies that don't fit with the neoclassical models, there are a number of new concepts that have emerged. In general, and underlying much of this work is a new concept of rationality as bounded rather than defined in the neoclassical model. The idea is that humans have limited computational capacity, particularly in real-world cases that are complex and uncertain. And humans don't seek to maximize expected utility or their utility functions, but they rather use decision procedures like satisficing, where an agent searches for satisfactory choices rather than optimal ones. And I've already mentioned this in a previous lecture, but I've provided you, for those who stay with me to the end, a YouTube clip to Tim Minchin's song on If I Didn't Have You, I'd Have Someone Else. And not just satisficing, but also sub-goal reasoning. So if it's the case that we can't maximize the utility in our utility functions, what we might do instead is determine particular goals that we want to achieve, which can be observed and measured, that are more realistic for us to aim for. And we might also divide decision-making among specialists so that those tasks are contained and more achievable. So that's from your Herbert Simon reading, your required reading for today. Ross Gittins extends this further. He notes how humans use heuristics. By this he means, and he's drawing on the literature here, heuristics is not a word specific to his work, but has been elaborated by other behavioural economists too. Humans use heuristics, by which he means rules or mental shortcuts that permit us to make decisions without having to carefully weigh up the pros and cons of every decision. And these heuristics bear the following characteristics. They're anchored, so if we are trying to make a decision, for example, as to whether or not to purchase Nescafe capsules, we might find them to be expensive if we're comparing them with instant coffee, but cheap compared with a cafe flat white. And by anchoring a decision in relation to a habit that I might have of purchasing a flat white at 10 o'clock every morning, I might find that the Nescafe capsules are worth my expenditure because they will be cheaper in comparison to current practice, which anchors me. If I'm an instant coffee drinker, that would be my anchor, and I would be unlikely to be purchasing Nescafe capsules. So those decisions are anchored in previous practice, in previous habits. The heuristics are also loss averse. Experiments and data from the field have shown that people are more likely to care about losing $50 than about winning $80. And then in order to take a gamble on winning a certain sum of money faced with the prospect of a loss of 50, one would need to have a greater chance of winning a larger sum of money. So we're loss averse. Behavioural economists have also found through their research that framing matters. So doctors are more likely to prescribe a treatment, for example, if it saves 90 lives in every 100 than if it kills 10 people in 100. Now that might seem to be the same scenario, and it may seem irrational that framing alone should produce an effect on behaviour, but experiments have suggested that this is the case, given the heuristics we use. The heuristics are also present biased, so if we shop when we're hungry, we purchase junk food that's not on our shopping list. Or as Andrew Lee has shown, drawing on other research in his own article, that we trade off between today and tomorrow in a way that privileges today. So when faced with a choice between $10 today or $11 tomorrow, many people would go for $10 today, losing $1 in order to get the cash now. But when faced with a choice between $10 in 7 days and $11 in 8 days, almost everyone is willing to wait another day because another day doesn't seem so long for another dollar. Another experiment asked people to choose movies, and when choosing for tonight, 2/3 of them went for a lowbrow movie like Indecent Proposal, and when choosing for 1 week's time, 2/3 opted for a highbrow movie like Three Colours Blue. So the idea is that we are biased towards the present in ways that do not really reflect what our deliberative ideas about our own good might involve. So it suggests, says Andrew Lee, that he doesn't use the idea of deliberative, but I do. We might have deliberative choices, as John Rawls might put it, that are really reflect our deeper interests, our greater interests, but given present biases, we're unable to act in accordance with those deliberative ideas. And Andrew Lee suggests that policies that constrain our choices can actually then make us better off over the lifetime. This is a kind of time inconsistency that we have in our decision making that leaves us vulnerable to making decisions that are actually not in line with our most deeply held interests because present biases get in the way. He points out without behavioural economics, we wouldn't be setting a compulsory school leaving age. We wouldn't be discouraging teen pregnancy. We wouldn't be having cooling off periods in major contracts. And if we think any of these measures are a good idea, welcome to the Behavioural Economics Club, as he puts it. According to Gitton's idea of heuristics, priming also matters. For example, our consumption has been shown to be affected by music, and not only that, by the very speed of the rhythm that's involved, that's playing in the background. We will purchase more if music is of a certain type. Studies have also shown that academic integrity improves if students sign an honour code before handing in assignments. Interesting from your point of view, I guess. And the heuristics also tend to a maintenance of the status quo. We prefer stability to continuous change. Social norms matter. There are other aspects of the heuristic that we use to take mental shortcuts that permit us to make decisions without carefully weighing up pros and cons, and these are some of them. As I said, this week the presentation of the material seems to require that I provide a larger place for part 3 this week, which is normally only treated in a cursory manner, in a short and pithy way at the end of the lecture. Today it seems appropriate to spend more time. Who gains, who loses, does it matter? Well, it seems to be dependent on how behavioural economics is used. As I said at the start, behavioural economics doesn't seem to respond to a historical problem as the previous economic theories did. And it seems to be much more explicitly committed to an idea like value neutrality, where the economists merely seeks to understand and explain human behaviour, human economic behaviour, in real life contexts, with the use of that information being something quite different. So the use that Pret-a-Manger and other enterprises and businesses make of behavioural economics can be quite different to the way in which a government might make use of behavioural economics in order to nudge people towards the type of behaviour that they think is in the social interest and is in their own interests, the interests of their people. So the question, who gains, who wins, does it matter, really depends on how behavioural economics is being used, since behavioural economics purports to be value neutral in providing knowledge rather than value judgments about what should be done with this information. So we need to ask the following questions in order to respond to those previous critical considerations. What are the implications? How is behavioural economics to be used? Well, there are implications for business, marketing and advertising, and there's implications for the state, collective projects. As Gittins points out, economists don't like to talk about advertising, or if they do, they see it as something that one needs to invest in if other businesses are also going to do likewise. To make it fit their model, Gittins points out, they assume that it's purely informational, that advertising is just conveying information. But we know that smart advertisers sell, he said, the sizzle, not the steak. They prey on our inadequacies and irrationalities. They subtly sell us propositions which become absurd as soon as someone puts them into words, that buying certain products will at last put us among the beautiful people or give us a healthy, happy family. So behavioural economics can assist businesses in understanding those subliminal motivations that push people to consume against their better judgment, in order to satisfy present biases, to fill their shopping trolleys with junk food when they'd really prefer fresh food, and so forth. How to shift people's purchasing habits in ways that reflect their irrationality and their limited computational capacities. Implications for the state. Behavioural economics has been used for collective projects as well, and I'll talk about that in a moment. As mentioned, behavioural economics doesn't give us any insight into what those collective projects should be, or even whether or not the use of empirical findings about our collective irrationality, about our irrationality as consumers, makes advertising, advertising and marketing techniques designed to make us consume more unethical. Behavioural economics doesn't provide any of that kind of insight, although Ross Gittins tries to push it to do so in certain interesting ways. Does behavioural economics really help to understand our deepest convictions and commitments and motivations? So those are some of the questions that this third part of the lecture leads me to ask. So I've already mentioned advertising and private business. How is it that behavioural economics might be used when it comes to the state and state action for collective ends? As mentioned, certainly behavioural economics has been used to inform advertising and other business techniques designed to increase our consumption by preying on inadequacies and irrationalities. When it comes to the state, it's also been used to inform the design of state intervention to achieve certain goals through nudging, through changing incentive structures, or through understanding how people's behaviour works to design institutions and decision processes in such a way that governments can get individuals to decide in ways that they think are better. So for Gittins, behavioural economists have found that one's happiness is mostly correlated with other people's assessments of oneself and not with one's income and wealth. And if this is the case, then he thinks we should give greater priority to policy that boosts mental health, provides satisfying and secure work, permits a secure and loving private life, ensures a secure community, upholds freedom and cultivates moral values that belong to a particular community. And he draws in his article on the work of an economist from the London School of Economics, behavioural economics crew to support that point. Gittins also points out that if it is the case that behavioural economics shows that happiness is actually not related in a clear way to income and wealth, but rather to mental health, satisfying and secure work, and so forth, then this suggests a number of policy implications for government, namely that reducing unemployment be given a much higher priority, that governments and employers can do a lot to raise subjective well-being by putting emphasis on the enrichment of jobs. Thirdly, by recognising the benefit of stability rather than continuous change to try to promote efficiency. Fourthly, that competition is not always good because rivalry can also create unhappiness. Fifthly, that instead of unquestionably promoting consumption and leaving that consumption to the willingness to pay of consumers for the products that they purchase, Gittins thinks that we need to be looking at whether there are some forms of consumption that yield more satisfaction than others, and trying to design our institutions in ways that nudge us towards that sort of purchase rather than others. We can recognise the significance of this in a context of climate catastrophe, for example, where it seems important that consumption be directed in some way to be sped along the pathway of environmentally sustainable forms of consumption, which may need nudge. Sixth, Gittins' point is that if income is subject to diminishing marginal utility, then there may be a case for redistributing income from rich to poor, but he notes that there's mixed evidence on whether people in countries with a narrow gap between rich and poor are happier than people in countries that have a larger gap between rich and poor, and that further empirical work is needed to ascertain what that link is, if there is one. Finally, he says we should be sceptical about the incessant calls for lower tax rates to encourage people to work harder, because what's important is the intrinsic satisfaction that we derive from work and not just monetary motives. So Gittins actually finds some degree of normative prescription in behavioural economics if it is the case that it finds that one's happiness is actually correlated less with income and wealth, and more with people's assessments of us. Sean Hargreaves-Heap also argues that we should try to boost trust, which permits cooperative outcomes, resolving the prisoner's dilemma. And if anybody's interested in a really interesting introduction to game theory, Sean Hargreaves-Heap has published an introduction to game theory with Yanis Varoufakis, who John King mentioned a couple of lectures ago when looking at post-Keynesian economics. Yanis Varoufakis was the Greek finance minister, and he worked at Sydney University too, and taught game theory in the School of Political Economy there for a number of years. And Peter Earle suggests that policy implications can help people cope better with a problem of choice and nudge them into taking decisions that increase the productivity and well-being of the nation, and the government has a really important role in that. In Andrew Lee's account of how behavioural economics does and can shape public policy, he goes further to provide 6 lessons for behavioural policymakers. The power of free, noting that if you want to use nudge effectively and really want to encourage something, there's a considerable advantage in making it free. Framing too, that framing can be used effectively to promote behaviour. So in the global financial crisis, Australians were much more willing to spend the stimulus payment that they received than recipients of similar payments in the US. And a possible explanation is that the Australian payment was described as a bonus, while the US one was described as a rebate. So framing can sometimes matter. Defaults matter too. So as I mentioned, the organ donor default, setting that to opt in as the default, increased the rates of subscription to those that actually indicated population-wide willingness to be a donor. Fourthly, losses are valued more highly than gains. So this can also be used effectively by. Andrew Lee points out, and this is linked to the Centrelink fiasco, Centrelink fiasco, that the pain involved in recouping a $1,000 government overpayment tends to be larger than the pleasure that accompanies an extra $1,000 payment. And one's policy that exploits this asymmetry is Save More Tomorrow, which allows US workers to commit to putting their next pay rise into savings, thereby gaining higher savings in the future without suffering wage losses today. So make the information simple as well as a 5th lesson, because behavioural economics recognise that people are time constrained. And randomise. A key feature of many of the studies discussed, he says, is that they're based on randomised policy trials. This includes testing new policy interventions in the same way we require pharmaceuticals to be tested before providing them with a government subsidy. So those are some of the ways in which Andrew Lee believes that behavioural economics can and does shape public policy. So it's not just about marketing and ways that reach the subliminal desires of consumers who might not even realise they initially wanted that purchase. It's also about how to nudge society in the direction that governments think would be good collectively. Now, forgive me for my own closing reflection, which I hope you'll give you some pause for thought. I thought I would finish by discussing something that leaves me a little bit wary of the behavioural approach, while nonetheless being interested in the critique that it offers of neoclassical accounts in trying to make sense of real processes of decision making. So far, and we discussed this too in the lecture on feminist economics, neoclassical versions of love and partnership are that you might decide to form a partnership with somebody as the outcome of a maximization of your utility function in the face of time and income budget constraints. So you know what you're looking for in your life and you think you can maximize what you most desire to have in your life by hooking up with your partner. And that's the neoclassical approach, if you like. Now, I've provided you with two behavioural economics views, which are different but potentially mutually informing. There's the bounded rationality satisficing view of Tim Minchin, reflected in his song, "If I didn't have you, then I'd have someone else." Listen closely to the lyrics, particularly the bit about how unlikely it is for him to have found his soulmate who's best suited for him at a university in Perth. This suggests a satisficing view where the costs of continuing to search for someone who is best suited to you no longer the costs involved outweigh the benefits of staying with somebody who might not be absolutely perfect. So that's one view, bounded rationality versus satisficing. Have a listen to the song. It's very funny. And the second behavioural economics view is reflected in another one of Tim Minchin's songs, reflecting a heuristics acceptance of status quo habits view. You grew on me like a malignant tumour. Regrettable, unhealthy, and irrational dependency. All of this reflecting a lack of rationality on the part of the people involved. So I wanted to leave you with a closing thought. Am I alone in finding all three to be deeply unsatisfactory? So all of these examples, neoclassical and behavioural, are still presenting this in a very highly individualistic manner. Do you think philosophy can help here? This is a PPE unit too, so many of you have done philosophy of various types, analytic, continental, applied, and so forth. How would you see love or partnership, and do you explain it to yourself in terms of an economic decision based on utility functions, a bounded rationality or satisficing view like Tim Minchin and Andrew Lee, by the way, in his book on the economics of everyday life? Do you see it as a heuristics of habits, acceptance of status quo norms, regrettable, unhealthy, irrational dependency? How do you view it? I remember in my first year of uni I didn't even know what philosophy was, to be perfectly honest, but flicking through the handbook in printed form, because the internet hadn't taken off at that stage, reflecting my age, I came across a unit on Love, Death and Freedom by Penelope Deutscher, who looked at existentialist and phenomenological accounts of love and death and freedom, and how our subjectivity is involved in these processes. So can we find an intersubjective and interdependent conception, for example, like Hegelian interdependency between individuals who are emotionally invested in shared cooperative projects, so that one's freedom is expressed through interdependency rather than through satisficing or through irrational dependency that reflects ingrained habits, or through the maximization of utility functions. I'll leave you with that thought. and I look forward to discussing behavioural economics with you on Thursday.